Hello, this is Meredith and welcome to Marvelous French, online French lessons for those who are learning French or who would like to learn French. In this video we're going to discuss the pronunciation of the French vowels. That would be A, E, I, O, U, or in French, A, E, I, O, U. Now this is actually part 1 of a 2-part video. So in this video we'll discuss the vowels, and in part 2 we'll do some pronunciation practice. So first of all, a couple of notes regarding vowels in French. French vowel sounds are short, pure, and staccato. Now in American English we have sounds that are similar to French vowels, but they tend to have an extra y or w sound to them that we don't see in French. The mouth also tends to be looser in English. French vowels, on the other hand, are very pure. There are no extra sounds, and the position of the mouth is precise with minimal movement. Another thing to note is that we're going to be focusing on the vowel sounds in their most pure state, when they're the only vowel in a syllable, for example. But in reality, vowel sounds can change drastically depending on what letters precede or follow a given vowel. For example, vowels followed by N or M will often produce a nasal sound such as on or un. And we'll go over some of these common sound combinations in a separate video. But again, in this video, we're just going to be talking about vowels in their purest state. So with that said, let's get started. So here we have the letter A, which is A in the French alphabet, and that's also how it's pronounced in its purest form, A. So again, the vowel sound is pure. In American English, letter A is often pronounced A, or we shorten the A sound to or I. In French, however, especially when A is the only vowel in a syllable, it will be pronounced A. So here we have some examples. Ma, façade, camarade, malade. Now sometimes you'll see A with an accent, the accent grave or grave accent, which is seen on the far left in blue here, or you'll see an accent circumflex or circumflex accent, which is seen on the far right here. In general, this doesn't change the pronunciation. A will still be pronounced A. Just to note that in the past, A with the accent circumflex was pronounced somewhat differently, but that difference is no longer as common. So for the most part, when you see A with either of these two accents that we have here, it will still be pronounced A. And here we have some examples. A, la, pâte, gâteau. So now that brings us to the letter E. Now E is quite a diverse letter in French. Depending on its position in a word, the pronunciation can vary. But in its purest form, when it's the only vowel at the end of a syllable with no accent, it tends to be pronounced E, what we call the mute E. You'll often see this mute E between two consonants. So this sound doesn't quite exist in English, but we do have a similar sound, which is the double O in words like book. But the French E is more precise with a rounded mouth. E. So if you want to approximate the sound, you can round your mouth and try to say E, and it should end up sounding somewhat like the French E. Now here are some examples of our mute E. Le, cela, menace, appeler. So a quick note here regarding the mute E, which again is pronounced E. Sometimes you'll find that this sound is omitted or swallowed in everyday spoken French when it comes in the middle of a 3-syllable word. So we have some examples here. Appeler, acheter, and lentement. In everyday French, instead of appeler, you'll often hear appeler. Acheter becomes acheter, and lentement is lentement. Now again, this applies to words with 3 syllables with the mute E sound in the middle, like appeler and acheter. If we compare that to a word we saw earlier, menace, which means threat, and only has 2 syllables, me and nas, we're not going to be able to omit the first E. We're going to have to pronounce it menace. So now a quick note about the mute E when it comes at the end of a word. In this case, it tends to be silent. We have some examples here. Chante, dommage, avoue, débile. So again, we see that the E at the end of each of these words is silent. Now, if you have a very short word with 2 or 3 letters where the only vowel is the letter E, like le, L-E, or me, M-E, the E, of course, is not going to be silent. It will be pronounced. But when you have a longer word that ends in E, with at least one other vowel preceding it, the final E tends to be silent. Now a note about the combination ENT when it comes at the end of a verb. In this case, it's silent as well. So we have some examples here. Ils chantent, ils avouent, elles parlent, elles appellent. So in each of these cases, we have ENT coming at the end of a verb, and again, it's silent. So just to note, the ENT ending is often attached to the third-person plural form of certain verbs. That would be the form used with they, as in they sing, or they admit, etc. Another note about they, there are 2 ways to say they in French. So in the first 2 examples here, we see ILS, il, which is the masculine form of they, used to describe a group of boys or men, or a mixed group of men, women, or boys and girls. Now in the last 2 examples, we see elle, E-L-L-E-S, which is the feminine form of they, that's used specifically to describe a group of all girls or women. Now we just said that ENT at the end of a verb is silent, but when we have ENT at the end of other words that aren't verbs, it's usually pronounced en. So for example, we have here intelligent and argent. Intelligent is an adjective. It's used to describe nouns, and argent is a noun. It's a thing. So neither of these are verbs, and in this case, ENT will be pronounced en. So we just spoke about our mute E, which is our unaccented E, but oftentimes you'll see E with some sort of accent, and this does have an effect on the pronunciation. So here we have the accents that you'll tend to see over the letter E. We have the accent aigu, or the acute accent, the accent grave, or the grave accent, the accent circumflex, or the circumflex accent, also known as the chapeau, which means hat in French, and finally we have the 2 dots known as tréma, or diaeresis in English. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the accent aigu, the acute accent. So the accent aigu, the acute accent, over the letter E yields a pronunciation E. So this is actually consistent. It's rare to be able to say that something is always the case in French, but here's one instance where we can. When you see the letter E with an accent aigu, it will be pronounced E. So here we have some examples. Été, télé, répéter, and préférer. Now just to note that there are 2 common combinations that involve the letter E that yield the same pronunciation as the E with an accent aigu, E. Now these 2 combinations don't have an accent, but they are the combination EZ and the combination ER when it comes at the end of a verb. So here we have some examples. Né, aller, parler, habiter. So again, EZ is always going to be pronounced E in French, and ER, specifically when it comes at the end of a verb, is also pronounced E. So we said that ER, when it comes at the end of a verb, is pronounced E. However, when we see ER at the end of words that are not verbs, ER will often be pronounced ER. As is often the case, there are exceptions, but it's a good general rule to keep in mind. So here are 2 examples, mère and chère. So mère is a noun. It's a thing. And cher is an adjective that's used to describe nouns. Neither of these words are verbs, so in this case the ER will be pronounced air. So we just looked at E with the accent aigu, which is pronounced E. Now let's take a look at a few accents that yield the sound E, what we call the short E. In English, EH often has that sound. So again, we have our accent grave, or grave accent, our accent circumflex, which is our circumflex accent, and our tréma. These three accents all yield the same sound when over the letter E, and again, that sound is E. So let's take a closer look at the E with the accent grave, the grave accent. So here we have our E with the accent grave, or grave accent, which again is pronounced E. And here are some examples. Lève, confrère, achète, père. So again, your E with your accent grave is pronounced E, and this is consistent. When you see the letter E with your accent grave, it will be pronounced E. Another accent that produces the same pronunciation when used with the letter E is what's called the accent circumflex, or the circumflex accent. So again, this is pronounced E, and so it sounds the same as the E with the accent grave, or the grave accent. So here are some examples. Rêve, fête, être, ferait. And this is another instance where the pronunciation is very consistent. When you see an E with an accent circumflex, it will be pronounced E. Another accent that has the same pronunciation as the accent grave and the accent circumflex when used with the letter E, and that pronunciation is E, is what's called the tréma, which is a little less common than the other accents we've discussed. So here are a couple of examples. Noël and Israël. Now another instance when E is pronounced E does not involve an accent, and that's when E is followed by two consonants. Now that could be a double consonant, two of the same consonants, two L's, two R's, etc., or two distinct consonants such as SP or ST. So here are some examples of E followed by two consonants, which yields the pronunciation E. Jette, espace, respecte, elle. So as is often the case, there's a notable exception, and that is the word est when it means is, as in he or she is, which comes from the verb être, to be. In this case, est is usually pronounced est. For example, il est français, he's French. When est, meaning is followed by a vowel, it can be pronounced et or et. For example, he is American can be il est américain or il est américain. Either is acceptable. Now, est has a second meaning, and that's the direction east. In that case, it follows the normal rule for E followed by two consonants, and is pronounced est. Now let's take a look at the letter I in its purest state. Now this is a little more straightforward than the letter E. For the most part, when it's the only vowel in a syllable, I is pronounced E. So this sounds a bit like our double E in English, but again, the sound is more pure in French. It doesn't have any extra sounds involved like y or w, and isn't pronounced I or like the letter I sometimes is in English. Another thing to note about the pronunciation of the French I is that it comes from the throat. I, I, I. So let's take a look at some examples. Liste, file, dirige, risque. And a quick note, sometimes you'll see an accent circumflex over the letter I. This does not change the pronunciation. It will still be pronounced I. So that brings us to the letter O, which in French has two main possibilities when it's the only pronounced vowel in a syllable. We have what's called the closed O, which sounds like O, and the open O, which sounds more like O. So the O is closed in the following three cases. Either when you have O followed by a silent consonant, basically when O is the final sound in a word. The second case is when you have O with your accent circumflex, and the third case is the combination O-S-E, O's. Now the O will be considered open, which again is when it's followed by a pronounced consonant, with the exception of the combination O-S-E, which again is pronounced with a closed O, O's. So let's take a closer look at the closed O. So again, the closed O is pronounced O, and we said there are three cases when the O is closed. So the first two examples here show us O followed by a silent consonant. Mo, trop. The third example shows us O with the accent circumflex. Drôle. And the fourth example is our combination O-S-E, which is pronounced O's, as in chose. So now let's take a look at the open O. So again, the open O sounds more like and this is when you have O followed by a pronounced consonant, with the exception of the combination O-S-E. So here we have some examples. Parole, botte, zone, homme. So the O is more open. It comes somewhere between the sound O and A. So now that brings us to the letter U, which in French is pronounced U in its purest form. So this is a sound that does not exist in English. Now if you round your mouth and try to say I, it should come out sounding like U, U, U. So here are some examples. Su, juge, russe, fumer. So just a quick note, sometimes you'll see the letter U with an accent circumflex, the circumflex accent. Just as was the case with the letter I, this does not change the pronunciation, it's just a part of the spelling. So now that brings us to the end of part 1 of this video. Part 2 will focus on practicing what we've gone over, practicing the pronunciation of vowel sounds. So please feel free to check that out. The link will be in the description box below. In the meantime, if you found this video helpful, please feel free to like, share, comment, and subscribe. So once again, this was Meredith with Marvelous French, and as usual, à la prochaine! See you next time.